The Middle Ages, often depicted as a dark interlude between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance, were actually a cauldron of creativity and ingenuity. From the 5th to the 15th century, this era was not just a stage for knights, castles, and plagues, but a time of inventions that transformed daily life and laid the foundations for the modern world. Far from being a stagnant period, medieval people demonstrated astonishing skill in solving practical problems, from feeding growing populations to navigating uncharted seas. Below, we'll explore in depth 10 medieval inventions that changed the world, with an informative tone and a touch of light humor, because while the Middle Ages had its share of drama, it also deserves a bit of levity in telling its story. Get ready for an extensive and detailed journey through these innovations that, without much fanfare, built the foundations of the world we know today. Imagine Northern Europe in the 7th century. Clay-heavy, sticky soils, like trying to knead bread with mud. The light plows of antiquity, designed for the sandy soils of the Mediterranean, were about as useful as a fork for digging a trench. Then came the heavy plow, an invention that burst onto the European scene around the 7th century and was nothing short of an agricultural revolution. This wooden colossus, reinforced with an iron plowshare that cut through the earth like butter and a moldboard that turned it over to aerate it, changed everything. The heavy plow not only made deeper furrows but allowed the cultivation of lands that were previously a headache. Its robust design, capable of withstanding the toughest soils, enabled peasants to work clay-heavy lands in regions like the Rhine Valley, the plains of England, and northern France, which were nearly impossible to farm before. In Flanders, for example, the clay soils of the lowlands became productive fields thanks to this invention, enabling the cultivation of wheat and rye in areas that were once marshy. The heavy plow was more than just a tool. It was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. The plowshare, a vertical iron blade, cut deep into the earth, while the moldboard, a curved piece, turned the soil to expose it to air and improve drainage. This design enhanced soil fertility by allowing nutrients to mix better, resulting in more abundant harvests. In the 8th century, peasants in Normandy began using the heavy plow to work marginal lands, increasing grain production by 20 to 30% compared to earlier methods. But what made this plow truly special was its ability to be pulled by teams of oxen, sometimes up to 8, maximizing efficiency. Peasants could work larger areas without collapsing from exhaustion, a vast improvement over light plows, which often required more human effort. In England, for instance, a single team of oxen could plow up to 120 acres in a season, a feat impossible with light plows. This invention not only boosted crop production but also reshaped the organization of farming communities. Peasants began working in open field systems, long strips of shared land that maximized the plow's efficiency. This system, known as the open field system, was a kind of medieval cooperative. Peasants shared oxen and tools, working together to cultivate the land. In England, villages were organized around these open fields, with each family farming an assigned strip of land. This fostered cooperation and created tighter-knit communities, as sharing oxen was more practical than each family owning their own team. By the 9th century, regions like Flanders and Normandy saw an increase in grain production thanks to the heavy plow, which supported larger populations and fueled the growth of early medieval cities like Paris and Cologne. In Flanders, for example, wheat production doubled between the 8th and 10th centuries, enabling local villages to become commercial hubs. The impact of the heavy plow went far beyond the fields. By increasing agricultural productivity, it allowed villages to grow into towns and towns into cities. Places like London and Bruges began to expand thanks to the agricultural surpluses made possible by the plow. These surpluses also boosted trade, as peasants could sell their grain in local markets, attracting merchants and artisans. By the 10th century, the markets of Ghent became commercial hubs thanks to the agricultural surpluses of Flanders, which relied on the heavy plow for production. In Bruges, merchants traded grain for cloth and spices, connecting Flanders to Mediterranean trade routes. Additionally, the heavy plow strengthened the feudal system, as lords could demand more tribute from peasants due to increased production. In many cases, lords invested this tribute in building castles, churches, and armies, consolidating their power. In the Frankish kingdom, Feudal lords used agricultural surpluses to fund military campaigns, such as those of Charlemagne, which expanded the empire in the 8th century. Without the heavy plow, feudalism would have struggled to sustain itself, and Europe's demographic and economic growth would have been much slower. Imagine a medieval world where most of the population was still scratching the earth with sticks, dreaming of a decent bowl of soup. The heavy plow not only filled granaries but laid the groundwork for urbanization, trade, and social stability in the Middle Ages. It also enabled the introduction of new crops, like rye, which was more resilient to heavy soils. This diversified the medieval diet and reduced dependence on a single crop, helping to mitigate famines. In the 9th century, regions like northern France began growing rye in large quantities, providing a more reliable food source during harsh winters. In England, rye became a key crop in the clay-heavy lands of the East, allowing communities to survive tough conditions. In East Anglia, for example, peasants grew rye to make black bread, a cheaper alternative to wheat that became a staple. The cultural impact of the heavy plow is also noteworthy. By requiring teams of oxen, it fostered cooperation among peasants, creating closer-knit communities. In England, medieval villages were often organized around a common, a shared plot of land where peasants collaborated on farming. This not only strengthened social bonds but also created a dynamic of collective work that influenced later social structures. By the 10th century, villages in Yorkshire adopted the open field system, allowing communities to share resources and boost production. Moreover, the heavy plow enabled communities to expand their arable land, reclaiming marginal terrains that were previously unusable. In regions like the Netherlands, peasants used the heavy plow to work drained marshlands, further increasing agricultural output. In Frisia, for example, peasants began cultivating reclaimed coastal lands in the 10th century, a process that would have been impossible without the heavy plow. This effort transformed the region into one of Europe's most productive, laying the foundation for the future prosperity of the Netherlands. If the heavy plow was the muscle of medieval agriculture, windmills and watermills were the brains that harnessed nature's energy. These inventions turned wind and water into the most efficient workers of the era, performing tasks that would have exhausted any human. Watermills, though already in use in antiquity, became the multitasking superheroes of the Middle Ages. Powered by the force of rivers, these machines not only ground grain into flour but also crushed or sawed wood, pressed olives for oil, hammered metal, and even helped brew beer. Picture a medieval workshop where the river was the foreman, working tirelessly without asking for a day off. By the 11th century, watermills proliferated across Europe, especially in regions with abundant rivers like France, England, and northern Italy. The Domesday Book of 1086, a census ordered by William the Conqueror, recorded over 6,000 watermills in England alone, giving a sense of their prevalence. Watermills operated with a simple yet ingenious system. A water wheel, driven by the river's current, was connected to gears that turned millstones or powered hammers and saws. In Cistercian monasteries, known for their focus on efficiency, complex systems of canals and mills automated multiple processes. At the Abbey of Clairvaux in France, monks used watermills to grind grain, press oil, and work leather, all powered by a single river. This not only boosted productivity but also freed monks to focus on prayer and study, contributing to the intellectual flourishing of the era. By the 12th century, Cistercian monasteries became hubs of technological innovation, and their watermills were a symbol of their ingenuity. At the Abbey of Fontenay, for example, monks built a system of canals that powered multiple mills, each dedicated to a specific task, from grinding wheat to forging tools. In cities, watermills made flour cheaper and more accessible, lowering the cost of bread, the staple of the medieval diet. This was crucial for urban communities, which relied on a steady food supply to support their growing populations. In London, watermills along the River Thames produced flour for the city's markets, enabling the population to grow from 15,000 to 50,000 between the 11th and 13th centuries. But not every place had a river nearby, and that's where windmills came in, appearing in Europe around the 12th century, likely inspired by designs from the Islamic world, such as those used in Persia. Unlike watermills, which depended on a nearby river, Windmills could be built anywhere with enough breeze, making them ideal for arid or flat regions like the Netherlands. By the 13th century, the Dutch began using windmills to drain marshlands, creating the famous polders that expanded arable land. This process not only increased food production but literally reshaped Europe's map, as the Dutch reclaimed land from the sea. In the 14th century, the polders of Holland enabled the cultivation of wheat and barley on lands that were once swamps, transforming the Netherlands into an agricultural powerhouse. Windmills were also used to grind grain, crush pigments for paint, and even pump water for irrigation. In regions like Castile, windmills became cultural icons, later immortalized in the adventures of Don Quixote, who mistook them for giants. In the 13th century, Castilian windmills produced flour for local villages, reducing dependence on rivers and allowing communities to thrive in arid regions. The impact of mills went beyond food production. By mechanizing tasks that previously required human or animal labor, mills freed up manpower for other activities, like trade and craftsmanship. This was crucial for the growth of cities, as it allowed communities to diversify their economies. In Bruges, watermills along the River Ray produced flour and textiles, turning the city into a commercial hub by the 13th century. Moreover, mills laid the groundwork for mechanization, a distant precursor to the Industrial Revolution. By demonstrating that natural energy could be harnessed to make human work more efficient, mills inspired future advances in engineering and technology. Culturally, mills became symbols of progress and prosperity, and in many regions, they were a source of local pride. In England, feudal lords often built mills and charged peasants for their use, generating additional income and reinforcing their power. In the 12th century, lords in Yorkshire built dozens of watermills, which became a key source of revenue. In short, windmills and watermills were the engines of the medieval economy, transforming production and paving the way for a more mechanized world. Let's now talk about an invention that sounds like it came straight out of an epic tale but had a brutal impact: the stirrup. Yes, that small harness that looks like a saddle for humans. Before the 8th century, riding a horse in battle was like trying to juggle while ice skating. Without stirrups, riders relied on balance and strength to stay in the saddle, making them look more like circus acrobats than fearsome warriors. The introduction of stirrups, likely brought from Asia by nomadic peoples like the Avars or Huns, changed the game. Historians believe stirrups reached Europe via the Asian steppes, possibly through the Huns in the 5th century or the Avars in the 7th century, and their adoption was a turning point in military history. With their feet firmly in stirrups, riders could wield lances, swords, or maces without fear of flying off like a sack of potatoes at the first charge. This gave rise to heavy cavalry, the human tanks of the Middle Ages that dominated battlefields with their gleaming armor and unstoppable charges. The Battle of Hastings in 1066, for example, showcased the power of Norman cavalry, which likely used stirrups to maintain stability during charges against the Saxons. Stirrups allowed riders to adopt a jousting position, where they could charge with a lance tucked under their arm, a technique that required stability unattainable without stirrups. In the 9th century, the Franks under Charlemagne used heavy cavalry to expand their empire, conquering territories from Italy to Saxony. At the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass in 778, Frankish cavalry demonstrated their superiority thanks to stirrups, which enabled more effective charges against enemies. But stirrups didn't just transform warfare. They also made horseback travel more comfortable and safer, facilitating trade, communication, and pilgrimages. Imagine trying to send an urgent message at a gallop without stirrups, basically an extreme sport with a high chance of ending up on the ground. Medieval roads were far from highways, and a rider without stirrups was prone to falling at the first bump. With stirrups, messengers could gallop faster, merchants could transport goods farther, and pilgrims could reach places like Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem without breaking their skulls. In the 10th century, messengers of the Carolingian Empire used stirrups to cover long distances, delivering orders and news at speeds that would have been impossible without this invention. On the Silk Road, merchants used stirrups to travel from Constantinople to Persia, strengthening trade networks between Europe and Asia. The impact of stirrups was also felt socially. Heavy cavalry, enabled by stirrups, required significant resources, such as trained horses, armor, and weapons, which reinforced the feudal hierarchy. Knights, often nobles or vassals of a lord, became a privileged class, and their battlefield prowess, thanks to stirrups, solidified the power of feudal lords. In France, Norman knights became the backbone of feudal armies, and their skill in battle, made possible by stirrups, gave them an almost mythical status. In the 11th century, Norman knights conquered Sicily and southern Italy using cavalry tactics that relied on stirrups. Without them, the iconic image of the medieval knight, galloping with lance and armor, would have been far less imposing, and feudalism would have had a weaker military foundation. Additionally, stirrups facilitated empire expansion, like that of Charlemagne, and long-distance trade, as riders could travel farther and more safely. In the 11th century, pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land used stirrups to make the journey more bearable, contributing to the rise of pilgrimages. In short, this small invention was like putting a seatbelt on a horse, and its impact was felt from battlefields to medieval markets. If stirrups gave wings to riders, the mechanical clock brought order to the chaos of time. Before the 13th century, telling time was an imprecise adventure. Sundials worked only when the sun was visible, and water clocks, used in some monasteries, were complicated and prone to freezing in winter. Medieval people relied on church bells, roosters, or their own fatigue to estimate the passage of time, which wasn't exactly a system worthy of a Swiss watch. Then came mechanical clocks, which used weights and an escapement mechanism to regulate movement. The earliest examples, like the clock at Salisbury Cathedral in England, date to the late 13th century and were true marvels of engineering. These clocks weren't the delicate wristwatches we know today. They were massive contraptions installed in church towers or public buildings, ticking with the grace of a dancing elephant. They worked via a system of falling weights that drove gears, moving hands, or ringing bells. Though not accurate to the second, they were far more reliable than guessing by looking at the sky. In monasteries, mechanical clocks ensured monks followed the canonical hours, a strict prayer schedule that structured their day. At the Abbey of Cluny, monks used clocks to coordinate prayers, enabling them to maintain strict spiritual discipline. In cities, public tower clocks, like the one at Strasbourg Cathedral, became focal points of urban life, regulating everything from markets to guild meetings. In the 14th century, the Strasbourg clock, with its mechanical figures and chimes, became an attraction symbolizing the city's progress. The impact of mechanical clocks went beyond practical organization. They changed the perception of time, shifting it from something fluid and subjective to something measurable and structured. In cities like Florence and Bruges, public clocks became symbols of prestige and modernity, and cities competed to have the most elaborate ones. The Prague astronomical clock, built in the 15th century, not only told time but also showed the position of the planets, becoming a tourist attraction of its time. This new perception of time fostered social discipline, as cities began regulating workdays and public events with greater precision. In Bruges, merchants used the market tower clock to coordinate the opening and closing of stalls, making trade more efficient. In Florence, textile guilds used clocks to regulate work hours, ensuring artisans met production deadlines. Moreover, mechanical clocks were an impressive technical achievement, requiring advances in metallurgy and mechanics that paved the way for later inventions, like pocket watches and scientific instruments. In the 14th century, astronomers began using clocks to measure planetary movements more accurately, laying the groundwork for modern astronomy. At the University of Oxford, professors used mechanical clocks to teach students about time and motion, contributing to scientific development. Without mechanical clocks, Galileo would have had to guess how long it took a ball to roll down a ramp, and medieval market schedules would have been a disaster. Imagine a merchant arriving late to sell his chickens because the sun was cloudy. Total chaos. Culturally, clocks reinforced the authority of institutions, as public clock bells set the rhythm of urban life. In short, the mechanical clock not only organized time but changed how medieval people lived, worked, and thought, laying the foundations for modernity. We can't talk about the Middle Ages without mentioning paper, an invention that reached Europe from China via the Islamic world around the 11th century. Originating in China in the 2nd century, paper spread through the Islamic world, where Arabs perfected its production, before arriving in Europe via Al-Andalus and Sicily. Unlike parchment, which required slaughtering animals and a laborious process, or papyrus, which was fragile and disintegrated in Europe's humid climate, paper was relatively cheap and easy to produce. The first paper mills in Europe, like those in Fabriano, Italy, used linen rags and water to create durable, versatile sheets. This process, though not as simple as it sounds, enabled large-scale paper production, revolutionizing writing and the dissemination of knowledge. Before paper, writing was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or the very patient. Parchments, made from sheep, cow, or goat hides, were expensive and required sacrificing an entire herd to produce a single book. A medieval manuscript, like the Codex Amiatinus, could require the hides of hundreds of animals, making books luxury items accessible only to monasteries, nobles, and kings. Papyrus, used in antiquity, was fragile and didn't fare well in Europe's damp climate, like a bad joke on a rainy day. Paper, on the other hand, was a game-changer. Being cheaper and easier to produce, it allowed scribes to work without going bankrupt, and knowledge began to circulate like never before. Medieval universities, emerging in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, benefited immensely. Students could afford copies of texts by Aristotle, Avicenna, or Thomas Aquinas, fueling a learning boom. At the University of Paris, students copied texts by hand on paper, creating personal libraries that would have been unthinkable before. In the 13th century, a student could buy a copy of an Aristotle text for the equivalent of a few days' work, compared to the months it would have cost for parchment. Paper also transformed bureaucracy and trade. Merchants could keep detailed ledgers, improving transaction efficiency. In Venice, merchants used paper to record dealings with the Islamic world and Asia, facilitating long-distance trade. In the 13th century, Venetian merchants kept detailed transaction records on paper, enabling them to expand trade networks to Egypt and Constantinople. Kingdoms and cities also benefited, as they could maintain more accurate records of taxes, laws, and contracts. This strengthened administration and enabled the growth of more organized states. In the Kingdom of Aragon, scribes used paper to document laws and tributes, improving governance. Even culturally, paper had an impact. Troubadours and poets could write their verses, and personal letters became more common. In the 12th century, Provençal troubadours wrote love poems on paper, allowing their works to circulate among European courts. Imagine writing a poem to your beloved on parchment that costs more than your horse. With paper, love became a bit more affordable. When Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 15th century, paper was ready to become the perfect medium for mass book production. Without paper, the printing press would have been far less effective, as parchments were too expensive for mass printing. Moreover, paper enabled the creation of ephemeral documents, like pamphlets and proclamations, which played a key role in spreading ideas during the Reformation and Renaissance. In the 15th century, printed pamphlets were used to disseminate political and religious ideas, like those of Italian humanists. In Venice, printers produced pamphlets criticizing the Church, helping pave the way for the Reformation. In short, paper not only democratized knowledge but also transformed administration, trade, and culture, making the Middle Ages a much more documented and connected place. Speaking of writing, the printing press, though it arrived at the end of the Middle Ages in the 15th century, is impossible to ignore. Around 1440, Johannes Gutenberg perfected a system of movable metal type that allowed pages to be printed quickly and accurately. While the Chinese had used wooden block printing centuries earlier, Gutenberg's system was an engineering marvel. Unlike wooden blocks, which had to be carved for each page, movable type could be rearranged to print different texts, making it far more efficient. The Gutenberg Bible, printed in 1455, is the most famous example of this technology, with its crisp letters and elegant design rivaling handwritten manuscripts. Before the printing press, books were copied by hand by monks who probably cursed silently every time the ink smudged. A single book could take months or years, and a mistake meant starting over or living with a page that looked like a child's scribble. The printing press enabled mass book production, lowering costs and making knowledge accessible to more people. Within decades, printing presses spread across Europe, from Mainz to Venice, Antwerp, and London. By 1500, an estimated 20 million books had been printed in Europe, a staggering figure for the time. This not only democratized knowledge but also fueled the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Scientific Revolution. Martin Luther's pamphlets, for example, were printed and distributed in thousands of copies, allowing his ideas to reach a mass audience quickly. In 1517, when Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, the printing press ensured those ideas spread across Europe in weeks. The printing press also fostered text standardization, reducing errors from handwritten copies and facilitating the exchange of ideas. Before Gutenberg, a handwritten text could vary significantly from one copy to another, causing confusion in academic circles. With the printing press, texts became more uniform, which was crucial for the development of science and philosophy. In the 15th century, scientific texts by Ptolemy and Euclid were printed with greater accuracy, allowing scholars to work with reliable copies. At the University of Bologna, professors used printed books to teach mathematics and astronomy, improving education quality. Additionally, the printing press transformed education, as students could access cheaper textbooks, and it boosted literacy, especially in cities, where guilds and merchants began valuing reading and writing as essential tools. In Venice, printing presses became hubs of intellectual activity, producing everything from scientific treatises to popular novels. Without the printing press, the modern world would have taken much longer to form, and monk copyists would likely still be complaining about hand cramps. The cultural impact of the printing press was immense. By making books more accessible, it allowed ideas to travel faster than gossip in a small village. The texts of Erasmus of Rotterdam, advocating church reform, spread widely thanks to the printing press, paving the way for the Reformation. In the 15th century, Antwerp printers produced copies of Erasmus's texts that were sold across Europe, amplifying his influence. The printing press also gave voice to new forms of literature, like romances and satires, which entertained the middle classes. In the 15th century, printed chivalric romances, like Amadis de Gaula, became popular among urban readers, who enjoyed tales of heroes and knights. In short, the printing press was the internet of the Middle Ages, connecting people with knowledge and ideas in a way never before possible. Another invention that sounds like medieval magic is the blast furnace, which gained popularity in the 13th century. Before this, working iron was a slow and inefficient process. Blacksmiths used small furnaces, known as bloomeries, that barely reached the temperatures needed to produce high-quality iron. The blast furnace, fueled by charcoal and powered by water or wind-driven bellows, reached much higher temperatures, enabling the production of large quantities of purer cast iron. This iron could be transformed into tools, weapons, armor, and machinery parts, from plows to church bells. In regions like the Rhine Valley, northern Italy, and Westphalia in Germany, blast furnaces became centers of economic activity, attracting artisans and merchants. In the Siegerland region, blast furnaces produced large amounts of iron exported across Europe, fueling both local economies and international trade. In the 14th century, iron production in Siegerland accounted for 20% of Germany's exports, making the region a key economic hub. This increase in iron production also boosted construction, as nails, hinges, and other components essential for buildings, bridges, and Gothic cathedrals could be made. At Chartres Cathedral, the iron supports for stained glass windows relied on blast furnace production, enabling the construction of taller, more elaborate structures. Without blast furnaces, the Middle Ages would have been a much flimsier place, and the Industrial Revolution, which depended on iron and steel, would have had to wait centuries to take off. The impact of the blast furnace wasn't limited to the economy. It also transformed warfare, as it enabled the production of higher quality weapons and armor in larger quantities. Medieval knights, with their gleaming armor, relied on iron from blast furnaces to protect themselves in battle. In the 13th century, the armies of French kings used swords and armor made with high-quality iron, giving them an edge in the Crusades. At the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, French knights used armor reinforced with blast furnace iron, allowing them to defeat a larger army. Additionally, blast furnaces fostered mining and metallurgy, creating new trades and strengthening local economies. In Sweden, iron production in the 14th century became a key industry, attracting investment and labor. Without this invention, agricultural tools would have been less durable, armor scarcer, and Gothic cathedrals, with their intricate iron supports, harder to build. In short, the blast furnace was the backbone of the medieval economy, providing the essential material for growth and progress. Not everything was work and war in the Middle Ages. There was also room for fashion and comfort, as demonstrated by the spinning wheel. Before the 13th century, spinning wool or linen was an exhausting task done by hand with a spindle and distaff, a process so slow it made peeling potatoes seem thrilling. The spinning wheel, likely introduced to Europe from India or the Islamic world, mechanized this process, allowing spinners to produce thread up to 10 times faster. This invention not only made clothing more accessible but also boosted the textile industry, a cornerstone of the medieval economy. The spinning wheel's design was simple yet effective. A rotating wheel, powered by a pedal or hand, wound fiber onto a spindle, creating thread continuously. This allowed spinners to work seated and at greater speed, reducing the cost of fabrics. Cities like Florence, Bruges, and Ghent became textile production hubs, exporting wool and linen fabrics across Europe. In the 14th century, Florence was renowned for its high-quality wool fabrics, sold in markets as far away as Constantinople. The spinning wheel also had a social impact, as many women, who traditionally did the spinning, found this work a source of income and autonomy. In many villages, women spun at home, selling thread to local weavers, giving them a more prominent economic role. In England, women in East Anglia villages produced thread used to make fabrics exported to the Netherlands, generating income for rural families. Without the spinning wheel, medieval fashion would have been far more limited, and everyone might have been wearing burlap sacks instead of elegant tunics. Moreover, this invention paved the way for later textile mechanization, as it showed that thread production could be more efficient with mechanical tools. In the 15th century, the spinning wheel combined with other innovations, like the spinning jenny, setting the stage for the textile revolution of the industrial era. In Florence, textile guilds used spinning wheels to produce fabrics that competed with those from the East, turning the city into an economic hub. In the 14th century, Florentine textiles accounted for 30% of the city's exports, demonstrating the spinning wheel's economic impact. In short, the spinning wheel not only clothed the Middle Ages but also wove the threads of economic and social progress. Another game-changing invention was the three-field crop rotation system, which became widespread in Europe around the 9th century. Before this, farmers used a two-field system. One year they cultivated, and the next they left the land fallow to recover. This system was inefficient, as half the land was idle at any given time. The three-field system divided the land into three parts: one for winter crops, like wheat, another for spring crops, like barley, oats, or legumes, and the third left fallow. This increased agricultural productivity by 50%, as only a third of the land was idle. Additionally, legumes like peas and lentils enriched the soil with nitrogen, improving fertility. This system allowed peasants to produce more food with less effort, leading to population growth and the rise of cities. In regions like northern France, the three-field system became the norm, and peasants began experimenting with new crops, diversifying the medieval diet. Legumes, for example, not only improved the soil but also provided a protein source that complemented bread, the era's staple food. This was crucial for reducing famines, a constant threat in the Middle Ages. In the 10th century, regions like Flanders and Normandy saw increased agricultural production thanks to this system, supporting growing urban populations. In Bruges, agricultural surpluses fueled the growth of markets, which became key commercial hubs in the 11th century. In Rouen, markets benefited from Normandy's agricultural surpluses, strengthening the regional economy. The crop rotation system also fostered agricultural innovation. peasants began experimenting with new crops and techniques, like using fertilizers and more intensive land rotation. This laid the groundwork for modern agriculture, which relies on diversification and efficient soil management. In England, East Anglia peasants began growing lentils and peas, improving both diet and soil fertility. In the 11th century, legume production in East Anglia accounted for 15% of total crops, helping reduce local famines. Moreover, the agricultural surpluses generated by this system boosted trade, as peasants could sell grain in local markets, attracting merchants and artisans. In the 11th century, Rouen markets benefited from Normandy's agricultural surpluses, strengthening the regional economy. In short, the three-field system not only prevented famines but also fueled the economic and social growth of the Middle Ages, turning villages into cities and markets into bustling hubs. Last but not least is the astrolabe, an instrument that seems straight out of a sci-fi movie but was the GPS of the Middle Ages. Introduced to Europe by the Arabs in the 11th century, the astrolabe was a multifunctional marvel. It could measure the altitude of stars, tell time, calculate latitude, and even predict astronomical events. Sailors used it to navigate open seas, astronomers to study planetary movements, and mathematicians to solve trigonometric problems. In an era when getting lost at sea was as common as misplacing your keys today, the astrolabe was a lifesaver. Perfected by Islamic astronomers like Al-Zarqali, the astrolabe reached Europe via Al-Andalus and Sicily. It consisted of a metal disc with moving parts, like the alidade, which allowed precise angle measurements. Sailors used the astrolabe to determine their position at sea by observing the height of stars above the horizon. This was crucial for maritime trade, as it allowed Venetian and Genoese merchants to navigate the Mediterranean with greater confidence, trading with the Islamic world and Asia. In the 13th century, Venetian merchants used astrolabes to travel to ports like Alexandria and Constantinople, strengthening Europe's trade networks. The trade route between Venice and Egypt relied on the precise navigation made possible by the astrolabe, and by the 14th century, Venice handled 40% of Mediterranean trade with Asia. The astrolabe also impacted science and education. In medieval universities, astronomers used astrolabes to teach students about planetary movements, contributing to the development of astronomy. At the University of Oxford, professors used astrolabes to demonstrate principles of trigonometry and Ptolemaic astronomy. In the 12th century, English astronomer Adelard of Bath wrote treatises on the astrolabe's use, which became standard texts in European universities. Additionally, the astrolabe facilitated pilgrimages, as travelers could navigate more accurately. In the 12th century, pilgrims traveling to Santiago de Compostela used astrolabes to navigate roads, making the journey safer. Without the astrolabe, the great explorations of the 15th century, like those of Columbus or Vasco da Gama, would have been far riskier. In short, the astrolabe opened the world to medieval people, connecting continents and expanding the horizons of knowledge. These 10 inventions, the heavy plow, windmills and watermills, stirrups, the mechanical clock, paper, the printing press, the blast furnace, the spinning wheel, the three-field crop rotation system, and the astrolabe, not only defined the Middle Ages but built the foundations of the modern world. Each solved a specific problem, from feeding people to exploring the cosmos, and together they transformed humanity. The heavy plow filled granaries, mills harnessed nature, stirrups empowered riders, clocks organized society, paper and the printing press spread knowledge, blast furnaces strengthened the economy, the spinning wheel clothed the world, crop rotation prevented famines, and the astrolabe opened the seas. The next time you think of the Middle Ages, don't just imagine knights and dragons. Think of these innovations that, without making much noise, changed the world forever.